The screech of metal against concrete echoed through the abandoned subway tunnel as Cale Thorne pressed his back against the rusted train car, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid underground air. 3 years had passed since the world above had fallen to the ravenous hordes, and still the sound of shuffling feet and guttural moans haunted his dreams. But today was different. Today, humanity would finally fight back. "Movement detected in Sector 7, whispered Lyra Chen Nakamura through the crackling radio strapped to Cale's shoulder. Her voice carried the weight of someone who had learned to speak only in hushed tones, every word a potential death sentence in this new world. Estimated 47 undead, moving northeast toward the old shopping district. Cale's weathered fingers traced the map spread across his lap, marking positions with practiced precision. The subway station beneath Portland's ruins had become their command center, a labyrinth of tunnels and forgotten maintenance rooms that the dead couldn't navigate effectively. Here, in the bowels of a city that once thrived with 2 million souls, the last organized resistance of the Pacific Northwest planned their most ambitious operation yet. "Dimitri, what's the status on the northern barricades?" Cale spoke into his radio, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had lost everything but his determination to see humanity survive. The response came through layers of static, Dimitri Voss's thick accent barely penetrating the interference. "Charges are set, Cale. My engineering background never prepared me for this kind of demolition work, but the calculations are solid. When we trigger the sequence, the entire block will funnel them exactly where we want them." Across the dimly lit station, Zara Blackwater hunched over a makeshift laboratory, her dark hair falling across her face as she worked frantically with vials and equations that might hold the key to their survival. The former CDC researcher had been studying the infected for months, searching for patterns in their behavior, weaknesses in their seemingly unstoppable advance. Her latest discovery had sparked the plan that would either save them all or serve as humanity's final desperate gambit. "The pheromone compound is ready," Zara announced, not looking up from her work. "If my calculations are correct, this will create a scent trail so powerful that every infected within a 50-mile radius will follow it directly into our kill zone." "But Cale," she paused, finally meeting his eyes across the station, "once we trigger this, there's no going back. We're essentially ringing the dinner bell for every zombie in the region." The weight of leadership pressed down on Cale's shoulders like a physical burden. In the corner of the station, Mira Ashworth tended to the wounded from their last reconnaissance mission, her medical supplies dwindling with each passing day. Osric Valdez cleaned his rifle with methodical precision, the young scout's hands never quite steady since he'd watched his sister succumb to a bite that had seemed so minor at first. Corvus rearranged explosive devices with the careful attention of an artist, each component a brushstroke in a masterpiece of destruction. These 7 souls represented the last hope for organized resistance in their region. Other enclaves existed scattered across the continent, small pockets of survivors clinging to life in subway systems, abandoned mines, and fortified buildings. But communication between groups had become increasingly sporadic, and rumors suggested that many had fallen silent forever. "The civilian evacuation tunnels are secure," reported Osric through the radio, his voice carrying the controlled tension of someone perpetually on edge. "Families with children have been moved to the deep shelters. If this goes wrong, they'll have enough supplies to last 3 months, maybe 4 if they're careful." Cale nodded grimly, knowing that if their plan failed, 3 months would only delay the inevitable. The infected didn't tire, didn't hunger for anything but human flesh, and their numbers grew with every person they caught. Traditional military tactics had proven useless against an enemy that felt no fear, followed no strategy beyond the basic drive to feed. But Zara's research had revealed something crucial about the undead that might finally give humanity an advantage. The infected retained a primitive pack mentality, following chemical signals and behavioral cues in predictable patterns. If they could exploit these patterns, channel the zombie hordes into carefully prepared killing fields, they might accomplish what conventional warfare had failed to achieve. "All units, this is command," Kale spoke into the radio, his voice carrying to every fighter position throughout the underground network. "Operation Lazarus commences in 6 hours. Check your equipment, confirm your positions, and remember, we're not just fighting for ourselves. We're fighting for everyone who didn't make it this far, and for everyone who might still be out there. Today, humanity shows these monsters that we refuse to go quietly into extinction." The war room buzzed with quiet intensity as dawn broke somewhere far above their concrete ceiling. Kale spread the detailed blueprints across the table, each line and measurement representing months of careful observation and planning. The shopping district that would serve as their battlefield had been mapped down to every store entrance, every stairwell, every potential bottleneck where the undead might cluster. "Dimitri, walk me through the demolition sequence one more time," Kale requested, his finger tracing the explosive placement markers on the blueprint. The former civil engineer had adapted his construction knowledge into an art of strategic destruction, turning the bones of the old world into weapons against the new nightmare. Dimitri approached the table, his movements deliberate and measured. "The first charges will collapse the overpass here," he pointed to the map's eastern edge, forcing the horde to funnel through these 3 main arteries. "Then, as they spread through the shopping complex, we trigger the secondary explosions to seal exit routes and create isolated pockets. Each group of infected becomes trapped in a predetermined kill zone." Zara looked up from her chemical preparations, exhaustion etched in every line of her face. "The pheromone trail will ensure they follow the path we've chosen. I've studied their behavior patterns extensively. They respond to certain scent compounds with almost mechanical precision. It's as if the virus hijacked their olfactory processing centers while leaving their basic motor functions intact." The scientific explanation provided cold comfort to Mira, who had seen too many bite victims transform despite every medical intervention she could attempt. "How many do we estimate will come?" she asked, though her voice suggested she dreaded the answer. "Conservative estimates put it at 3,000, Osric replied from his position near the radio equipment. "But if Zara's compound works as effectively as she believes, we could see 5,000 or more. Every infected between here and the coast will catch that scent." Corvus tested the detonation timing on one of his devices, the soft clicking of the mechanism unnaturally loud in the underground silence. "My explosives are designed for maximum psychological impact as well as physical damage. The sound alone should disorient them, disrupt whatever coordination they maintain through their pack behavior." Kale studied each of his team members, seeing in their faces the same mixture of hope and terror that he felt churning in his own chest. 3 years of survival had taught them all that hope was a dangerous luxury, yet without it, there seemed little point in continuing the fight. "I've been thinking about something," Lyra said quietly, her fingers absently adjusting the radio frequencies. "Before the outbreak, I worked in communications for the Emergency Management Agency. We always had contingency plans for natural disasters, terrorist attacks, even foreign invasion. But we never planned for something that would turn our own people against us. Every protocol we developed assumed we could distinguish friend from foe." The observation hung heavy in the air. The infected weren't foreign invaders or natural disasters, they were parents and children, co-workers and neighbors, transformed into something that retained human appearance while harboring an utterly inhuman hunger. Fighting them required a psychological toll that conventional warfare couldn't match. "My wife became one of them," Dimitri said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "She was bitten while helping evacuate a school. I watched her change over the course of 18 hours, watched everything that made her human simply drain away. When she finally turned, she looked at me with such hunger that I barely recognized her face. He paused, his hands trembling slightly. Today, I fight not just for survival, but for revenge against the thing that stole her from me. Mira moved closer to Dmitri, her medical training extending beyond physical wounds to encompass the emotional damage they all carried. We're all fighting ghosts in some way. The question is whether we can channel that pain into something constructive rather than letting it consume us. Zara carefully sealed her final pheromone compound in a reinforced container, the liquid inside glowing faintly under the artificial lighting. This formula represents everything I've learned about their biology. If it fails, I don't know what other options we have. The infected seem to be evolving, adapting to our tactics. Some of the newer ones show signs of improved coordination, almost as if they're learning from previous encounters with human survivors. The implications of her words sent chills through the group. An enemy that could adapt and learn posed an exponentially greater threat than mindless monsters driven only by hunger. Then we make sure this works, Kale declared with more confidence than he felt. We've lost too much to fail now. Every person we couldn't save, every community that fell while we learned how to fight, their sacrifice has to mean something. Outside their sanctuary, the city above remained trapped in perpetual twilight, its streets empty except for the endless wandering of the dead. Somewhere in that wasteland, other survivor groups might be watching for signs of hope, waiting for proof that organized resistance was still possible. Today's operation would send a message across the ruins of civilization: humanity refused to surrender. The pre-dawn hours brought a supernatural stillness to the underground command center, broken only by the rhythmic checking of equipment and the soft murmur of final preparations. Kale moved through their makeshift base like a general inspecting his troops before a battle that would determine the fate of nations, though their army consisted of 7 souls and their nation was measured in city blocks. Pheromone deployment commences in 30 minutes, Zara announced, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. She had spent the last hour triple-checking her calculations, knowing that even a minor error in concentration or placement could doom them all. The compound would be dispersed through the old mall's ventilation system, creating an irresistible trail that would draw every infected creature for miles around. Osric crouched beside his sniper rifle, adjusting the scope with practiced precision. I've counted 17 different groups of infected within visual range of the mall perimeter. They're scattered, but once that scent hits the air, they'll converge like iron filings drawn to a magnet. His young face bore the premature lines of someone who had seen too much death, but his hands remained steady. Lyra's radio crackled with status reports from the scattered survivors who would monitor the operation from safe distances. Echo Team reports all clear in Sector 12. Bravo Team has visual confirmation on the eastern approach routes. If anyone's still alive out there watching this, they'll know whether organized resistance is possible. The weight of that observation settled over the group like morning fog. Their operation would serve as more than a military action, it would be a statement about humanity's refusal to accept extinction. Either they would prove that strategic thinking could overcome the mindless horde, or they would provide a spectacular example of how hope could lead to destruction. Dmitri made his final adjustments to the detonation timing, each explosive charge synchronized to create a cascade of destruction that would channel the infected into predetermined killing fields. The charges are armed and ready. Once we trigger the sequence, the mallscape will be transformed into a maze designed to trap and eliminate the infected. But we'll only get one chance. If any significant number escape the initial containment, they'll spread word through whatever primitive communication network they maintain. Mira distributed the last of their medical supplies, knowing that anyone seriously injured during the operation would likely not survive. Their ammunition was limited, their escape routes few, and their margin for error essentially non-existent. Yet each team member displayed the quiet determination of people who had already lost everything and discovered they still had something left to fight for. Kale, Corvus said quietly, approaching with his final explosive device, I want you to know something. My daughter would have been 8 years old today. She didn't make it past the first week of the outbreak. Every bomb I build, every charge I set, I'm thinking about her. About the birthday party she'll never have. The personal revelations had become a ritual of sorts, each team member sharing something precious that had been lost, transforming their mission from mere survival into something approaching sacred duty. They fought not just against the infected, but against the amnesia of catastrophe that threatened to erase everyone who had mattered. Contact, Osric's voice cut through the emotional undercurrent, snapping everyone back to immediate reality. Large group moving in from the northwest. Estimated 200 infected, moving in loose formation toward the mall perimeter. Zara, we need that pheromone trail active now. Zara activated the dispensing mechanism, watching through security monitors as invisible chemical signals began permeating the abandoned shopping center. Within minutes, the effect became visible as scattered groups of infected suddenly altered their meandering paths, drawn toward the mall with purposeful determination that was both encouraging and terrifying. It's working, she breathed, watching the screens as more infected emerged from buildings and alleyways, all converging on their target location. They're responding exactly as the behavioral models predicted. But Kale, the numbers are already exceeding our estimates. I count over 800 and they're still coming. The mall's corridors, empty for 3 years except for the occasional scavenger team, began filling with shuffling figures drawn by scents that triggered primitive neural pathways. The infected moved with the same inexorable purpose as migrating animals, following chemical signals that promised the fulfillment of their singular hunger. All teams, prepare for Phase 1 detonation, Kale commanded, watching the tactical display as red dots representing infected continued multiplying across the screen. Dimitri, on my mark, seal the western entrances and force them toward the main corridor. The explosion echoed through the underground tunnels like thunder, shaking dust from the ceiling and confirming that their plan had moved beyond theory into deadly reality. Above ground, tons of concrete and steel collapsed across predetermined access points, transforming the mall from an open space into a carefully designed trap. Western approaches are sealed, Dimitri reported. The Horde is being funneled toward the central corridor exactly as planned. But Kale, motion sensors indicate the numbers might be approaching 1,200. We're dealing with a larger concentration than anyone anticipated. Through the security feeds, they watched the infected pour into the mall like floodwater, their movements still retaining individual characteristics but their destination unified by chemical imperative. Some ran with jerky, spastic motions while others moved with predatory grace, but all were drawn forward by the scent of promised prey. The main corridor of Westbrook Shopping Center had become a river of rotting humanity, flowing toward the central court where Zara's pheromone compound reached its highest concentration. Through grainy security feeds, the team watched their carefully laid trap fill with more infected than their most pessimistic projections had suggested possible. 1,500 and climbing, Osric reported from his observation post, his voice tight with controlled anxiety. Kale, they're not just coming from the immediate area. I can see groups arriving from the industrial district, the riverside, even from areas we thought were completely cleared months ago. Lyra's radio equipment suddenly exploded with activity as other survivor groups throughout the region began reporting massive movements of infected. Base, this is Raven's Nest. We're seeing complete evacuation of infected from our vicinity. They're all heading your direction. The transmission crackled with interference, but the implications were clear. Their operation had triggered the largest concentration of infected anyone had witnessed since the initial outbreak. Mira watched the security monitors with growing alarm, her medical knowledge providing unwelcome insights into what they were observing. Look at how they're organizing themselves. The fresher infected are taking positions near the exits while the older ones push toward the center. It's almost like they understand the concept of tactical positioning. Zara's face had gone pale as she processed the implications of what her compound had accomplished. I designed it to be irresistible, but this goes beyond simple chemical attraction. They're demonstrating coordinated behavior that suggests some kind of collective intelligence. The virus might be facilitating communication between hosts in ways we never imagined. Dimitri's hands hovered over the detonation controls, waiting for Kale's command to trigger the next phase of explosions. The structural charges are ready, but with these numbers, even our kill zones might not be sufficient. We planned for maximum concentrations of 3,000. We're already approaching 2,000 and they're still arriving. The weight of leadership had never felt heavier as Kale studied the tactical display, each red dot representing a creature that had once been human, now transformed into something that retained human cunning while harboring inhuman hunger. The plan they had crafted with such care was succeeding too well, drawing every infected creature within a 50-mile radius into their carefully prepared trap. Movement in the lower levels, Corvus reported from his position near the old department store anchor. They're not just filling the main corridors, some are finding service passages and maintenance areas. It's like they're actively exploring the space, learning its layout. Through the monitors, they could see infected examining doorways, testing barriers, and even attempting to operate simple mechanisms like door handles. The mindless zombie horde of popular imagination bore little resemblance to the calculating predators that now filled their battlefield. Kale, Lyra said quietly, I'm picking up radio chatter from other survivor groups. They're asking if we're responsible for clearing infected from their areas. If this operation fails, we won't just lose our own lives, we'll have doomed every other surviving community in the region by concentrating all the infected in one location. The moral weight of unintended consequences pressed down on everyone in the command center. Their desperate gambit to prove humanity could fight back might instead demonstrate the opposite, that human ingenuity could make their situation catastrophically worse. Phase 2 detonation in 60 seconds, Kale announced, his voice carrying the steel resolve of someone who had accepted that retreat was no longer possible. Dimitri, collapse the eastern wing and drive them toward the main kill zone. Everyone else, prepare for close engagement once the explosions begin. Zara made final adjustments to her chemical monitoring equipment, tracking how the pheromone concentrations were affecting infected behavior. Kale, I'm seeing something unexpected. The infected closest to the highest pheromone concentrations are becoming agitated, almost aggressive toward other infected. The compound might be triggering territorial responses. The observation offered a glimmer of hope in their increasingly desperate situation. If the chemical trail was causing the infected to turn on each other, their trap might accomplish the elimination objectives even if the coordination and numbers exceeded their expectations. Contact front. Osric's voice cut through their analysis as his rifle cracked, dropping an infected that had somehow found an unguarded access route. They're probing our defensive positions. Some of them are learning our locations through observation. Mira moved quickly to treat a minor cut on Corvus's arm where debris from the explosions had found its mark, but her attention remained fixed on the monitors showing the growing chaos above. If these creatures retain learning capabilities, they might be adapting to our tactics even as we implement them. Every engagement teaches them something about human defensive behavior. The security feeds showed infected beginning to cluster around the areas where explosions had occurred, not fleeing from the destruction but investigating it with curious intensity. Some pawed at the rubble while others appeared to be testing the structural integrity of remaining barriers. They're not behaving like animals responding to chemical stimuli, Dimitri observed grimly. They're acting like an occupying force assessing their new territory. Kale, I think we may have underestimated exactly what we're dealing with. The realization that their enemy possessed capabilities beyond basic predation transformed their tactical situation from challenging to potentially hopeless. Yet retreat remained impossible, the infected had surrounded their position, and their underground sanctuary would become a tomb if the operation failed completely. All teams, prepare for Phase 3, Kale commanded, knowing that their next decision would determine whether humanity's last organized resistance in the Pacific Northwest would end in victory or serve as an elaborate form of suicide. The third detonation sequence sent shockwaves through both the shopping center and the underground command post, as Dimitri's carefully calculated explosions reshaped the battlefield according to their desperate plan. Dust and debris rained from the ceiling as the team felt the building's death throes reverberating through their sanctuary 60 feet below. Eastern wing collapse confirmed, Dimitri reported, his voice steady despite the chaos above. The infected are being channeled into the central core exactly as intended, but Kale, the structural damage is more extensive than anticipated. Some of the support pillars are showing stress fractures that could lead to complete building collapse. Through the security monitors, they watched the mall transform into something resembling a medieval siege, with infected climbing over the rubble of collapsed sections and pouring through the remaining corridors like floodwater seeking the lowest point. The central court had become a seething mass of undead humanity, pressed together in concentrations that defied imagination. Pheromone levels are reaching toxic saturation, Zara announced, monitoring her chemical sensors with growing excitement. The infected in the center are beginning to show signs of neural overstimulation. Watch Sector 7, they're becoming disoriented, aggressive toward each other. The monitors revealed the unexpected success of Zara's compounds as infected in the highest concentration areas began attacking their own kind, driven beyond the chemical thresholds that normally maintained their pack coordination. What had begun as an organized convergence was degenerating into chaotic violence as the creatures turned against each other. Osric's rifle spoke again from his elevated position, dropping infected that had found their way too close to their defensive perimeter. Confirmed kills approaching 50 from this position alone, but Kale, they're learning to avoid the sight lines where they've seen muzzle flashes. Some are using the bodies of fallen infected as cover to advance. The tactical adaptation displayed by their enemies sent chills through the command post. These were not mindless zombies but predators capable of learning and responding to human tactics in real time. Every shot revealed their positions, every explosion taught the infected something about human defensive strategies. Corvus, what's the status on the final demolition sequence? Kale asked, knowing that their ultimate success depended on triggering a controlled collapse that would bury the concentrated infected while leaving their escape routes intact. Corvus checked his remaining explosives with methodical precision, each device representing hours of careful preparation and irreplaceable materials. The final charges are positioned to bring down the entire central section. But once we trigger this sequence, we'll have approximately 8 minutes to evacuate before the underground passages become inaccessible. There won't be time for second chances. Mira moved through their small group, checking each person's condition and distributing the last of their medical supplies. The sustained stress and physical demands of the operation had pushed everyone to their limits, and she could see the toll in their faces. Everyone needs to understand that once we start the evacuation sequence, anyone who falls behind will be lost. We move together or we die together. Lyra suddenly looked up from her radio equipment, her face showing a mixture of hope and terror. Kale, I'm receiving transmissions from multiple survivor groups across the region. They're reporting that infected populations in their areas have dropped to nearly zero. Our operation is working exactly as intended. We've drawn every infected creature for hundreds of miles into this location. The magnitude of their success created its own form of terror. If they could eliminate the concentrated infected, they would effectively clear the entire Pacific Northwest of the undead threat. But if they failed, the concentrated horde would disperse back across the region with knowledge of human defensive capabilities and tactical thinking. Phase 4 detonation in 90 seconds, Kale announced, watching the security feeds as the infected continued pouring into their kill zone. Dimitri, are you confident the timing will allow us to reach the deep tunnels before the collapse? Dimitri studied his calculations one final time, knowing that mathematical precision would determine whether they lived or died in the next few minutes. The charges are synchronized to create a progressive collapse from north to south. If we begin evacuation immediately after detonation, we should reach safety with approximately 2 minutes to spare. But Kale, any delay or unexpected obstacles could trap us. Zara gathered her remaining chemical samples and research notes, knowing that her discoveries about infected behavior and pheromone manipulation could prove crucial for other survivor groups. If we don't survive, I've left detailed notes about the compound formulation and behavioral observations in the sealed container near the radio equipment. Other groups need to know what we've learned. The finality of her words hung in the air as each team member made peace with the possibility that their desperate gambit might end in their own destruction. They had chosen to risk everything on a single operation, gambling that strategic thinking could overcome impossible odds. Contact multiple sectors. Osric called out as his rifle began firing in rapid succession. They're attempting coordinated assault on our defensive positions. Some are creating diversions while others probe for weaknesses. Kale, these things are using military tactics. The revelation that the infected had somehow developed or retained strategic thinking capabilities made their situation exponentially more dangerous. They were no longer fighting mindless predators but facing enemies that could adapt, learn, and coordinate their attacks. All teams, immediate evacuation to the deep tunnels, Kale commanded as Dimitri's hand moved toward the final detonation trigger. Corvus, your point. Mira and Zara, stay close. Dimitri, trigger the collapse as soon as we clear the command post. The moment had arrived when their months of planning, their accumulated knowledge, and their desperate courage would be tested against an enemy that had evolved beyond their worst nightmares. Above them, thousands of infected creatures waited in what would either become their tomb or humanity's greatest victory. The evacuation began with controlled precision that quickly devolved into desperate flight as the team abandoned their command post for the narrow maintenance tunnels that led to the deep shelters. Behind them, Dimitri's finger poised over the final detonation trigger, his calculations measuring their lives in seconds and structural tolerances. Move! 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 Kale shouted as they navigated the cramped passage, their flashlight beams cutting through darkness that seemed to press against them with physical weight. The sound of their footsteps echoed ahead, announcing their retreat to whatever might be waiting in the tunnels beyond. Corvus led the way with his explosive expertise guiding them past unstable sections and potential bottlenecks, while behind them the sound of collapsing concrete began as Dimitri triggered the first sequence of charges. The building above groaned like a dying giant, its death throes vibrating through the underground passages. 30 seconds until final collapse. Dimitri called out, his voice barely audible over the increasing rumble of destruction above. Through the walls, they could hear the screams and roars of thousands of infected being crushed under tons of debris, their inhuman voices creating a symphony of destruction that would haunt the survivors' dreams forever. Zara stumbled on loose concrete, her precious research notes scattering in the darkness, but Mira caught her arm and pulled her forward without breaking stride. The samples. Zara gasped, reaching back toward her dropped materials, but Osric's firm grip prevented her from stopping. The knowledge is in your head, he told her firmly. That's more valuable than any notes. Behind them, the final detonation sequence began with explosions that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The building above ceased its dying groans and began screaming in earnest as steel and concrete surrendered to forces they were never designed to withstand. Breach in Tunnel 7. Corvus shouted as they reached a junction where water and debris were already beginning to cascade through cracks in the ceiling. The collapse is affecting underground structural integrity. We need to alter our route. Lyra's radio crackled with static-filled transmissions from other survivor groups as seismic monitoring equipment throughout the region registered the massive structural failure above. Base, this is Eagle's Nest. We're reading massive ground disruption from your position. Confirm your status. Can't respond now, Kale gasped as they navigated through a section where the ceiling had partially collapsed, forcing them to crawl through spaces barely wide enough for human passage. All communication equipment stays silent until we reach the deep shelter. The sound of rushing water grew louder as the destruction above began affecting the underground infrastructure. Broken pipes and damaged foundations created new hazards that their evacuation plans hadn't anticipated, forcing them to improvise routes through increasingly unstable passages. Temperature spike detected, Mira observed, noting that their enclosed environment was becoming noticeably warmer. The building collapse might have damaged gas lines or electrical systems. We could be dealing with fire hazards in addition to structural collapse. Dimitri checked his watch as they reached another junction, calculating their progress against the spreading destruction above. We have approximately 4 minutes before the underground passages become completely inaccessible. The next tunnel section should be stable, but beyond that, we're in uncharted territory. Through the concrete above them, the screams of dying infected had largely ceased, replaced by the grinding sound of settling debris and the occasional crash of secondary collapses. Their trap had worked with devastating effectiveness, eliminating what might have been the largest concentration of infected ever assembled. Air quality deteriorating, Corvus noted as he detected the acrid smell of burning materials filtering down through the damaged infrastructure. The collapse has created fires above us. We need to reach the deep shelter before smoke inhalation becomes a factor. Osric paused at a junction where multiple tunnels converged, checking his compass and trying to orient their position relative to the shelter entrance they sought. If my calculations are correct, we're approximately 200 meters from the entrance to the deep shelter system. But this tunnel section shows signs of recent structural damage. The passage ahead showed ominous cracks in the walls and ceiling, with loose concrete and twisted metal creating obstacles that would slow their progress. Each second of delay brought them closer to being trapped in an underground tomb of their own making. Single file, Kale ordered as they approached the damaged section. Test each footstep before committing your full weight. If this section collapses while we're inside it, the mission ends here. Zara followed closely behind Kale, her mind already racing ahead to what their success might mean for other survivor groups. If their pheromone compounds and tactical insights could be replicated, other communities might finally have effective weapons against the infected. But first, they had to survive their own victory. Light ahead, Lyra called out, pointing toward what appeared to be the reflection of their flashlights off polished metal. The shelter entrance should be just beyond this section. The final stretch of tunnel seemed to extend forever as they moved with careful haste through increasingly unstable passages, the weight of their success and the proximity of safety creating its own form of tension. Behind them, the destruction they had unleashed continued to claim victims, while ahead lay the uncertain promise of survival in a world they had fundamentally changed. The deep shelter opened before them like a cathedral of survival, its reinforced walls and emergency lighting systems representing 3 years of careful preparation for exactly this scenario. As the team collapsed onto the steel benches that lined the entrance chamber, the magnitude of what they had accomplished began to settle over them like morning fog. Seismic activity is stabilizing, Dimitri reported, checking the monitoring equipment that tracked the destruction above. The collapse appears to have been contained within the mall structure and immediate vicinity. Underground integrity beyond this point should remain stable. Lyra activated the long-range radio equipment, immediately receiving transmissions from survivor groups across the Pacific Northwest. The reports were consistent and almost unbelievable. Infected populations throughout the region had simply vanished, drawn away by their chemical lure and eliminated in the massive collapse. This is remarkable, Zara breathed, reviewing the data streaming in from other communities. We've effectively cleared an area encompassing nearly 300 square miles of infected. The pheromone compound worked beyond our most optimistic projections. Mira moved through the group, checking each person for injuries and stress reactions, her medical training recognizing that survivors of such intense operations often experience delayed psychological effects. We need to process what we've accomplished, but also acknowledge what it cost us. We triggered the deaths of thousands of creatures that were once human beings. The moral weight of their success created its own form of trauma. Each infected creature they had lured to destruction had once been someone's family member, friend, or neighbor. The virus had transformed them into predators, but underneath the infection, human remains still lingered. Motion sensors in the upper tunnels are reading zero activity, Osric confirmed, monitoring the security systems that protected their shelter. For the first time in 3 years, the surface appears to be completely clear of infected presence. We actually did it. Corvus examined his remaining explosive materials, calculating how their techniques might be adapted for other operations. The demolition methods we developed could be replicated by other survivor groups, but they'd need careful training and precise timing. This wasn't just about explosives, it was about understanding infected behavior and exploiting their weaknesses. Kale stood before the large map that covered one wall of the shelter, marking their operational success with a sense of accomplishment tempered by profound exhaustion. Their desperate gambit had proven that organized resistance could achieve what seemed impossible, but it had also demonstrated the terrible cost of victory in their new world. "I'm receiving transmissions from communities as far away as Sacramento and Vancouver," Lyra reported, her voice filled with amazement. "News of our success is spreading through the survivor networks. People are asking for detailed operational procedures and chemical formulations." The realization that their local victory might spark a broader resurrection of organized resistance created its own emotional burden. They had proven that humanity could fight back effectively, but they had also demonstrated that such victories required enormous sacrifice and perfect execution. Zara began documenting their discoveries about infected behavior, chemical manipulation, and tactical coordination, knowing that this knowledge might prove crucial for other communities attempting similar operations. "The infected showed capabilities we never anticipated: strategic thinking, adaptive learning, coordinated communication. Future operations will need to account for enemies that can evolve their tactics." Through the shelter's communication systems, they began receiving requests for assistance from survivor groups who wanted to attempt their own clearance operations. The success at Westbrook had transformed them from desperate survivors into tactical experts whose knowledge might save communities across the continent. "There's something else," Mira said quietly, studying the medical data they had collected about infected behavior during the operation. "The autopsies I performed on recovered infected specimens showed signs of recent neurological changes. The virus appears to be evolving, developing new capabilities that make the infected more dangerous but also potentially more vulnerable to targeted interventions." As night fell somewhere above their shelter, the team gathered around the radio equipment to coordinate with other survivor groups and share their hard-won expertise. Their victory had opened new possibilities for human resistance, but it had also revealed the true complexity of the enemy they faced. "This is Cale Thorne, Westbrook Resistance Command," he spoke into the radio, his voice carrying to communities throughout the region. "We've proven that strategic coordination can achieve large-scale clearance of infected populations. But we've also learned that our enemy is more sophisticated than we understood. The fight for humanity's survival has entered a new phase." The responses came flooding in from settlements that had been isolated for years, their voices filled with hope tempered by hard-earned caution. The zombie apocalypse was far from over, but for the first time since the outbreak began, organized human resistance had achieved a decisive victory. As dawn broke over the cleared landscape above their shelter, the 7 survivors of Westbrook Command prepared to emerge into a world they had fundamentally changed, carrying knowledge that might tip the balance in humanity's favor, if they could survive long enough to share it. In the distance, Zara's instruments detected faint chemical signatures that suggested some infected had survived the collapse, scattered but learning from their encounter with human tactics. The war was far from over, but the terms of engagement had changed forever.